One of the most popular spiritual writers of the last 50 years is Henry Nouwen. And in an Advent meditation, Henry Nouwen writes, "Waiting is not a very popular attitude." I think he probably speaks for many of us. Waiting is not a very popular attitude. But it's a part of life, isn't it? The reality that sometimes we just simply have to wait. One of the great minds of the 20th century, Simone Weil, observed, "Waiting patiently in expectation is the foundation of the spiritual life." There's a lot of content in that one sentence. Waiting patiently in expectation is the foundation of the spiritual life, which is a way of saying that waiting is not mere passivity. We aren't meant to sit on our hands while we wait. Commenting on today's epistle lesson from James, N.T. Wright observes, "Patience is one of the key aspects of the Spirit's work in our lives." Three strong statements to begin this sermon. Patience is one of the key aspects of the Spirit's work in our lives, says Bishop Wright. So to be clear, we are to grow over time in our ability to show patience. As people of faith, we are not meant to stay stuck forever, being chronically impatient. So Bishop Wright's point is, it's not just our self-help that moves us forward regarding becoming more patient. It's the work of the Spirit over the course of our lives to help us become more gentle, more understanding, and more patient over time. One of my benign obsessions is reading biographies of C.S. Lewis. I just cannot get enough of biographies of C.S. Lewis. So I'm now on the third volume in a trilogy of biographies by Harry Poe, who is a professor just over at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. It's a great trilogy on C.S. Lewis, and the third volume is the last 20 years of Lewis's life, which means after World War II. And Poe makes the point that there's a very clear reality with regard to the arc of Lewis's career. The first half of his career, Lewis could be very hard on his students and very impatient with their immaturity and their lack of insight and their lack of appreciation of his brilliance in some cases. But Poe makes the point, after the war, Lewis knew what those students had been through who were able to come back from their service in the war. Lewis knew himself what World War I had done to him. And so there's a very clear trend with Lewis. The last 20 years of his life, he was much more patient with his students, much more gentle. And he saw the students on a more equal basis. Life is meant to make us more gentle over time, more understanding. Poe goes on to make the point, Lewis continued to hold his students to very high standards. But he did so, says Poe, in a more gentle, understanding, patient manner. We can do both. We can maintain high expectations and at the same time become gentler and more patient. James writes in chapter 5, verse 7a, "Be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord." Be patient, therefore. Therefore refers to the preceding 6 verses that are not a part of our epistle lesson for today. But those 6 verses are key to understanding the lesson that we have in today's service. James 5, 1 through 6 is a warning to those with socio-political power and status that they are to be kind to the poor and those who are less fortunate. In the HarperCollins Study Bible, the section heading over James 5, 1 through 6 is "Warning to Rich Oppressors." There's a statement for you. Warning to rich oppressors is the subject matter of James 5, 1 through 6. And so verses 7 and following then are addressed not to the powerful, but to the poor and the marginalized. Having warned those who are powerful to see others with more kindness and to work toward their betterment, James now says to those who are poor and on the margins of society, "Be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord," which is James's way of saying there will be justice. History is moving to its fulfillment. And there will come a time when the fundamental equality of all will be recognized. So James acknowledges, on the one hand, that those in powerful positions oftentimes lord it over those less fortunate. He also reaches out to those who are on the margins of culture and says, in God's time, all will be made right and the true equality of humanity will be recognized by all. About the warning to rich oppressors, N.T. Wright comments, "This is one of the sharpest warnings against careless luxury anywhere in the Bible." That's just a wonderful phrase in the middle of all that. Careless luxury. Careless luxury is what James is criticizing in 5, 1 through 6. Wright goes on to observe about the passage, the church must keep James 5, 1 through 6 at its elbow. Another great phrase. I thought about that phrase as I was preparing this sermon. I inherited a desk in our new home, and the desk is wider than my arm span. And when I sit down to prepare a sermon or a class or a meditation, I fill the entire desktop with books and Bibles and a Greek text, and I love different colored ink. I've got pens of every color. There's stuff all over my desk, seriously. Debbie just comes in sometimes, man, there's a lot going on there. For one sermon, there's stuff everywhere. Why am I telling you this? But what I need the most stays at my elbow. What I need the most, I keep the closest to me. And so Bishop Wright makes that point about James. We're to keep the wisdom of James close to us for daily living. Be patient, therefore, beloved, says James, until the coming of the Lord. The Lord will come, says James, and there will be justice for all. To help make the point, James continues, the farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. This is a very accessible image from James in the time of his life. In that part of the world The climate is very predictable. There's a rainy season and a dry season. And farmers know what to do in the rainy season, and they know during the hot, dry summer, in large part, they have to wait and trust that nature will once again produce a crop from the rains that came earlier. So, commenting on this passage, Carl Holliday, my mentor, writes, "For those who must have immediate results, farming is the wrong profession." Right? Sometimes we just realize we're in the wrong line of work, or I shouldn't have done this. And you can't farm without patience. You also can't farm without hard work. But hard work and patience can go together. And that's what James is teaching his hearers. The Lord will come. God will bring about a time of justice and true peace. In the meantime, we have to learn to be patient. Some things come to those who wait. But again, it doesn't mean sitting on our hands doing nothing. We are to work for justice in the here and now. But ultimately, Christ himself will return and usher in the kingdom of God in its fullness. So I learned a lot this week. I learned something every week in my study and preparation. It's one of the joys of preaching at this stage. I know there's something new out there, and I try to find it every week. Here's what I found this week. In the New Testament, there are 300 references to Christ's return, from Matthew to Revelation. 300 references to the second coming of Christ. That's a reference for every 13 verses in the New Testament. That constitutes a recurring theme, doesn't it? 300 references to the second coming of Christ. So in commenting on James and its historical setting, Kent Hughes writes, James didn't have to compete with that. Kent Hughes writes, James was written to people who ached for the second coming of Christ. It's a great phrase. People in the first generations after Jesus' time on earth ached for his return. Think about it. Christians of later generations, including us, we have come to terms with what scholars call the delay of the second coming. The earliest generation of Christians were looking every day for the coming of Christ. And so James understood that. He also understood sometimes God's timing and humanity's timing are not quite in sync. And so he says in verse 10, as an example of suffering and patience, beloved, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Just think about the great prophets in the Old Testament era who looked forward to the coming of the Messiah. None of them lived to see it, but they maintained their faithfulness and their hope. And in God's time, that baby was born in that manger in Bethlehem. And so James says our patriarchs and matriarchs, the prophets before us, are examples of patience and endurance. Messiah has come, says James, and Messiah will return, says James. In the meantime, it's the work of God's Spirit to help us have patience and to show endurance. So again, the words of Kent Hughes, a contemporary of ours. James was written to people who ached for the second coming of Christ. Really, the whole New Testament was written to people who ached for the second coming of Christ. One of the 300 references to the second coming in the New Testament is in 2 Peter. 2 Peter 3:8, and it's some of the most memorable words in all of the New Testament. The meaning is very similar to the passage today from James. In 2 Peter 3:8 we read, "But do not ignore this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like 1 day." It's Peter's way of saying God's timing, God's sense of time is hard for human beings to comprehend. But what we can comprehend is we are the beloved of God. History is moving toward its ultimate fulfillment. And in that great day, when Christ does return, there will be equal justice, absolute radical equality among all of God's children. So I want to close with this, just an homage to just how practical the Epistle of James is. I argue that it is the most practical book in all of the Bible. There is not a word of James that can't be applied directly to 21st century modern living. James was a moral theologian above all else, and James's whole epistle is meant for people to realize that their faith, which they hold dear, is always meant to lead to concrete actions that honor God and are life-giving to others. So James is a moral theologian. James wants faith to be put into action always. And so in addition to the counsel about patience, there's one more teaching at the end of this lesson. I just want us to finish with it. It's very brief. At the end of the passage, James says, "Beloved, do not grumble against one another, so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the doors." Having talked about patience and endurance, James shifts to a little bit different emphasis. And what he's saying is this: instead of being anxious about when the Lord will return, we should focus on Christ-like actions within the community. And if we're Christ-like in our attitude, James says, we won't be so prone to judge one another. We won't be so prone to self-righteousness. It's a beautiful little teaching just tucked in at the end of today's passage. Beloved, do not grumble against one another, so that you may not be judged. See, the judge, Christ, the Spirit, is standing at the doors. So I finish with this. The words of James and the words of Jesus aren't always exactly the same, but their point has remarkable coherence. We talk about the epistle of James, but James is really a sermon. And though the exact wording isn't the same, the epistle of James, in the end, feels a lot like the Sermon on the Mount. There's difference in wording, but there's a lot of crossover in meaning. See if this sounds familiar from the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus in Matthew 7, verse 1. Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. Right? The teaching of James is really saying exactly the same thing. Don't be so quick to see the fault in someone else when the risen Christ knows your own imperfections. But that's where grace comes in. We're all forgiven. But the words of Jesus himself, do not judge so that you may not be judged. In his dynamic translation of the Sermon on the Mount, in his book, The Message, Eugene Peterson translates Matthew 7:1 this way: Don't pick on people, jump on their failures, criticize their faults, unless, of course, you want the same treatment. Amen.